Hello everyone, and welcome back to Feeding His Sheep. Today we're going to conclude our study of Mark chapter 5. We're going to finish up verses 21 through 43. You know, there's an old Alfred Hitchcock movie that I'm never going to forget. It began by introducing the audience to this hateful woman who was just used to having everything her way. She grew up wealthy, and because of her wealth, she was always able to get away with any wickedness that she did, until she committed murder, that is. The judge told her that her wealth wouldn't get her out of any of this and sentenced her to life in prison. She was dragged away by the bailiffs, screaming threats at the judge and at everyone. On the bus ride to the prison, they passed the prison cemetery. There was an older prisoner out there in the process of burying someone, and he was by himself. There were no guards around him, just him and this horse-drawn wagon that they used to carry the casket. The wheels began turning in her head, and she hatched a plan. Within a few days, she befriended the man who was at the cemetery. She found out that he had a problem. He had a need. He had cataracts and was losing his eyesight. So she told him about her wealth and promised that if he was to help her escape, that she would pay to have a doctor come to him and fix his vision. The man agreed, and they hatched a plan. The man told her that whenever an inmate died, the coffin was placed upon that cart that she had seen, and the guards would ring a bell, signaling to him it was time to come and do his job. So the next time she heard a bell, she's supposed to find the cart and crawl inside the coffin. He would then proceed to the cemetery. The plan was to bury her and then come back after dark and help her out, and then she would be scot-free. Well, several weeks passed by when all of a sudden she heard the bell. She hurried to the area near the gate, and she saw the wagon loaded up with a coffin and waiting. She looked this way and looked that way, and then she climbed aboard and settled inside the coffin next to its occupant. Within a few minutes, she could hear voices and then felt the cart begin to move. And she heard the squeak of the prison gates being opened, and then the clang of the gates as they latched shut behind her. Then all she heard was the hooves of the horse as she bounced around aboard this primitive wagon, and she thought, I am scot-free. Then when she was lowered into the hole, she had to hold back pangs of anxiety. She heard the dirt being tossed in on top of her. Well, to ease her mind, she just sat there and began to rejoice about the success of her scheme. It was working just fine. Within a matter of just a few short hours, that caretaker would be back and she would be home free. Well, the few hours came and went, and she grew anxious, wondering what's taking so long. So she fumbled around, trying to reach the matchbook she had in her pocket, and she had to maneuver the person next to her out of her way, and then finally managed to reach that matchbook. She struck a match, was able to get a glimpse of the time on her watch, and it was nearly midnight. Now, she was supposed to be released shortly after sundown. Well, more time went by, oxygen became thinner, and it felt like everything was closing in on her. It's just getting hard to breathe. And out of curiosity, she lit her last match and looked at her watch and saw that it was 3 a.m. And just as that match was about to go out due to a lack of oxygen, she turned and looked at the person next to her and saw the face of the caretaker. You know, if you're going to trust in someone to get you to the other side, make sure it's someone who has already been there. Now, so far in our study of Mark, we've seen Jesus heal the sick, heal a paralytic, cast out demons, forgive sins, calm a storm, and with a single command cast out a legion of thousands of demons. And every time the people stood astonished and they said, who is this? Who has this kind of power over things? And for the first time, they were about to see his authority over even death. Now, he would raise several people during his ministry and then finally conquer death himself after the crucifixion. But at this point, they had yet to see the full extent of the power of Jesus. And as he is on his way to do this miracle, he's interrupted by someone else in need. And so we're going to see a miracle within a miracle. And these two people have absolutely nothing in common other than they have a need for Jesus. So as we see yet another display of the power of Jesus, even his power over the grave, I also want us to focus on the availability of Jesus. He was always busy. He was always in demand, but he was never so busy that he turned away anyone who ever came to him for help. There was so much power, so much popularity, but yet such pity and compassion and availability. Never forget that we still have that today. We serve a risen Savior. He cares for us, and he is always there for us when we need him. And the day is coming when he will raise us up from the grave as well. We marveled when Jesus went driving out individual demons to driving out thousands with the one command. Now we're going to read with amazement at Jesus raising someone from the dead, but don't forget that the time is coming when he will raise millions from the dead with the single command. So let's go on in Mark chapter 5. We'll begin with verse 21. When Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and so he stayed by the seashore. So we see them arriving back at Capernaum. He had recently left that area, and that is when he calmed the storm. And then he drove out the legion after sailing 6 miles around the bend to Gennesaret. But the people of Gennesaret and the people of Gadara didn't want him there. Even after this display of power, they asked him to leave. And he did. That's the way God is. He is the perfect gentleman. He will not force himself to be in the life of someone who does not want him there. And he will still continue to give that person breath. He will allow the rain to fall on the wicked and the faithful alike while life on this earth continues. The people can refuse and reject God all they want to here on earth, and he will let them. For now. The time is coming, however, when one must pay the price for a life without God. That is the day when the bill is handed to you containing the wages of every sin you have ever committed. Your sin will either be paid for on the cross by Jesus or it will be paid for in eternity. The choice is yours. Now those Gadarenes, they felt uncomfortable around Jesus and they wanted to stay in their comfort zone away from him, and he consented. So Jesus went where he was wanted. The Gadarenes will answer for their choice one day, but for now, he goes to help those who want him there. For whatever their reasons may be, whether they be selfish or sincere, he is going where he is well received and wanted. And look at this reception. The crowd is instantly there. I wonder if some of them probably never left when he set sail the first time. Here, Jesus is welcomed heartily. Now, some of them are just there for selfish reasons, but Jesus still shows compassion for them. He still helps them. By this point, you could say that he has reached the ultimate celebrity status. There are tens of thousands of people constantly crowding him. Everyone is clamoring for his attention at the same time. And this has caused me to think about something a lot. Will it be the same way in heaven? Will Jesus be available to us? Will there be so many people that he won't ever have time for a one-on-one relationship with you or with me? I imagine the number of people in heaven from the time of the Garden of Eden up until the kingdom, that's going to be as numerous as the sand on the beaches. And everyone there will be true worshipers of Christ, not just like those in Capernaum wanting a miracle. So like I said, will we even stand a chance to gain his attention? Will we ever have an intimate moment of one-on-one conversation? Will Jesus still be available to all? Or are we going to have to cut a hole in the ceiling like the paralytic's friends did just to get closer to him? The Left Behind novels, they took a guess at how that works. But in the end, it's still just a guess, from the human imagination. In that story, if you're not familiar with it, they were all around Jesus at the start of the millennial kingdom. The crowds were everywhere. But yet the characters could hear Jesus speaking to them individually in their hearts. To them, it seems as if he was making eye contact with them the whole time. But he was speaking to everyone at once, yet individually at the same time. That is the power of God. Now, like I said, this comes from the mind of a human imagination from authors of that book. Now, will it really be that way? I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us in detail. But currently, the Holy Spirit of God dwells within all believers simultaneously. He counsels us all individually and independently. So that means it is possible. But let's take a look how people were still able to gain access to Christ. Let's go on and cover verses 22 through 24. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up and on seeing him fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live." And he went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressing in on him. You know, I find it a miracle itself that a man of the synagogue has come to Jesus and is showing remarkable faith. Already the Pharisees and the scribes, they're busy hatching plans to kill Jesus. They're off somewhere in the darkness just trying to find a conspiracy, trying to find something they can trip him up with. But here is a man of the synagogue who is breaking away from them. And this is likely at a great price to his standing among them. He had to sacrifice likely his career to come seek Jesus. You know, you think of Nicodemus, when he sought Jesus, he went at night under cover of darkness so the other Pharisees wouldn't see him. We're told about Jairus that he is a synagogue official. He isn't a Pharisee. He's not a teacher. His role consists of caring for and tending to the scrolls. He conducts the order of service. He oversees all the details. So he does have a prestigious position there. And he has reached to the point that he no longer cares what the others think. He doesn't care what the scribes and the Pharisees think. He has something going on in his life that makes this personal. His little girl is sick, and like a good father, he's going to do anything in his power to help her, regardless of the cost. And this girl is beyond just sick. Mark records him in this gospel as saying she is at the point of death. Luke said she is dying. So Jairus comes to the only one he knows who can help. Now, how did Jairus come to have so much faith in Jesus? Remember all of those things Jesus has done in the synagogues alone? I mean, he may have well been there that day that Jesus cast out a demon in the synagogue, when that demon declared that Jesus is the Holy One of God. Maybe Jairus was there, or maybe he had heard about the man with the withered hand that was healed in the synagogue. While all of his colleagues focused on the fact that this was done in violation of the Sabbath, he really saw the miraculous power behind that, and he remembered that. So he came to the conclusion that Jesus is the only one that's going to be able to help his little girl now. Now, I want us not to overlook the emotion of the text here. It's so easy to separate ourselves from the emotion as we just read the printed words describing what happened a couple thousand years ago. You need to open up your hearts to the plight of Jairus. Try to put yourself in his sandals. His child is sick. His little girl is dying, and he gets the idea that Jesus just might be able to help her. This is a hard decision. Going to Jesus is going to have severe repercussions on his career, but I don't think he really cared about that. His kid is more important than his job. But leaving her side during what could be her final hours had to be what was the most excruciating, knowing that if he left to seek Jesus, that could well be the last time he sees his little girl alive. And without the intervention of Jesus, that would have been a correct assumption. So he would literally have to tear himself away from her. You know, she could have been calling out to him, wanting him to hold her hand, but he knows that he has to go meet Jesus. So he tears himself away from her side, and he rushes to the seashore, for he has heard all of this commotion coming from there. That means Jesus is back from wherever it was that he sailed off to. So he gets there, and the crowds are already surrounding him. He is still by the shore of the sea, still just offside of the shore because the crowds are so thick. And time is of the essence, and all of these people, this crowd is in his way. His little girl's life is on the line, and these people are stopping him from getting to Jesus. But somehow this dedicated dad manages to make his way through the crowd. I don't know if he's throwing elbows or shoving, finding some sort of supernatural dad strength, but he does it. He gets to Jesus, and what does he do? He falls down at his feet, begging for help. So we see the extreme dedication in this father and also extreme faith. He tells Jesus, if you could just lay your hands on her, she will be healed. And to his great astonishment and to his great relief, Jesus agrees to go with him. I love that. I love that Jesus is available to all. There is no screening process that you have to go through. There's no applications to fill out, no ivory tower to climb. There's no background checks. We see just a dad coming to him for help and pouring his heart out, and Jesus was available. So they're on the road now. Jesus is on his way to Jairus' house. They're hoping to get there in time. And then all of a sudden, life throws a curveball. Here comes an interruption. We'll go in verses 25 and 26. A woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. Let's stop right there for a minute. God works in mysterious ways. To Jairus, things were not moving fast enough as it is. Have you ever had those dreams, or a nightmare, I should say, when things just go in slow motion? There's a monster after you, or you're in the middle of a building that's on fire, and you can't move fast enough. It's like your limbs are made of lead and you're just going slowly. To Jairus, that's how things were. Things aren't moving fast enough. His daughter's condition is critical, minute by minute, and here they are, moving along slowly, because these crowds wouldn't give them enough room to move quickly. They are pressed in on all sides, everybody clamoring for Jesus' attention. And I imagine that Jairus was just about ready to explode. Lord, just do something. Cast these people off to the side. Just make a gust of wind, carry them all away so we can get there. This slow, stressful journey now comes to a screeching halt. There's an interruption. Someone else needs Jesus' help as well. But you notice Jairus doesn't say anything. By faith, he lets Jesus do what he does. So this study today is now about two people. Very different people. One, as we mentioned, Jairus is the very respected ruler of the religious establishment. The other is a woman who is sick, weak, poor, and unclean according to the Mosaic law. We are told here in the scripture that she has a hemorrhage. Other translations say an issue of blood. Now, whether this means a menstrual issue or something else, as in a ruptured artery, we don't know, but the problems are the same. She is losing blood, and she has been for 12 years. Could you just imagine for a moment how this has affected her? Losing that much blood, she is anemic. She has become weak. Mark records that she had suffered much at the hands of physicians and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. Interestingly, Luke, the physician, doesn't mention that part. Luke, the physician, leaves that out. He simply said she was incurable. Up until the last 150 years ago or so, nobody was ever really cured of anything. We didn't understand bacteria, viruses, the cardiovascular system. We didn't understand anything about the human body. But there were physicians who at least tried, and they took all of her money and didn't help her. In fact, they just made her worse. And not only did they make her worse, but they had made her poor as well. Now, you want to know what medical advice she received was? Well, according to the Jewish writings called the Talmud, they had used several different toxins and astringents, and that didn't work. She'd gotten worse. So they turned to the other prescription of the Talmud for someone who had this ailment. Are you ready for this? They were to carry the ashes of an ostrich egg in a linen bag during the summer, and the ashes of an ostrich egg in a cotton bag during the winter. If that didn't work, they could carry a barley corn kernel that was found in donkey dung. Or they could drink wine that contained alum and crocuses. If that didn't work, they could drink wine mixed with onions. So these doctors were of no help either. And neither could she turn to anyone for spiritual help. According to the book of Leviticus, she was declared unclean ceremonially during the flow of her blood. She could not enter a synagogue. She could not enter the temple. Furthermore, as if that wasn't bad enough, anything or anyone that she touched was now unclean. So everybody avoided her. For 12 years, she could not touch her husband or her children if she had a family. There were no hugs from friends and support, not even a pat on the back. Everyone avoided her like the plague. So not only was she sick, but terribly and utterly alone in the world. So now we have two people coming to Jesus on this day. Both of them have great faith, and both of them are sincere. They might be completely opposite, but they do stand out in the crowd. One of them is atop the ladder in society, and the other one is unclean and at the bottom. And what I love is that even though Jesus is already on an important mission, he has time for her too. He didn't say, you know what, you've made it this long, you've made it 12 years, what's one more evening gonna hurt? I'll come back to you after I help Jairus. No. Let's take a look at how this transpired. We'll go into verses 27 through 34. After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak, for she thought, if I just touch his garments, I will get well. Immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that power proceeded from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, Who touched my garments? And the disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, Who touched me? He looked around to see the woman who had done this, but the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Have you ever noticed all of the different ways that Jesus used to heal people who needed it? There was nothing magical about his garment. We do not need to start worshiping the tunic that Jesus wore. What she really believed was all she had to do is just touch it, not because of the garment, but she believed in the one that wore the garment. The power wasn't in the garment. The power was in the one who wore it. Jairus asked Jesus to place his hands on his daughter and she would live, and Jesus agreed to do just that. But it didn't have to involve a laying on of hands for Jesus to work a miracle. Matthew chapter 8 records another thing. It's similar to this, a healing from a distance. In Matthew 8, starting in verse 5, And when Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, imploring him, and saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion said, Lord, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. So just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, Go, and he goes. And to another, Come, and he comes. And to my slave, Do this, and he does it. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who were following, Truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. So in verse 13 of Matthew 8, Jesus said to the centurion, Go, and it shall be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed that very moment. Jesus healed in many other odd and fascinating ways. One time he spit in the dirt, he made some mud out of it, and then rubbed it into a man's eyes, and he was cured of his blindness. If you ever go to an optometrist that does such a treatment, get out of there. Go find someone else, even if that's the only one your insurance will pay for. But Jesus done this. That shows there's nothing powerful in the method used. You don't want somebody else rubbing spit and mud in your eyeball. There was nothing powerful in the method or the way that he used, whether it's touching a garment, laying on hands, making mud pies, or carrying the ashes of an ostrich egg in a pouch. The method means nothing. Having faith in Jesus means everything. Jesus calls attention to her. It said that he asked who it was that touched him. Comically, the disciples said, Are you serious? The question should be, who isn't touching you? The crowd was so pressed in on Jesus that many people made contact with him, physical contact. But only this woman did so with the faith in his ability to help her. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." We must be careful not to take this and run with it. There are a lot of people out there who have great faith and they still suffer. They have great faith and they have not been healed of whatever ails them. We must always pray that God's will be done. Maybe it's not God's will that you are healed of whatever ails you. I don't understand it either, but He probably has a purpose for it that we will know someday. Maybe He has a purpose for someone's ailment that we don't understand this side of eternity. But we should always pray that God's will be done. As we said in our last study, sometimes God allows bad things to exist so that He can accomplish His purposes with them. You know, it's no coincidence that these two people encountered Jesus on the same day, at the same time. I want you to notice something here in the text, something that happened around the same time 12 years previous to the time that we just read. Go back to the time when Jesus was about 20 years old. His ministry had not yet begun. Hardly anybody outside of the people in Nazareth had heard of him. He was living a quiet life of obscurity. He's living in Nazareth with his family. And it was during this time when Jesus was around 20 years old, the woman of this story first noticed her bleeding, and she knew that this wasn't normal. She knew that this wasn't right. Something is wrong here. So this happens with her. When Jesus is about 20, she first noticed her bleeding. Now in another household, not too far away from there was a young synagogue official rejoicing with his wife because the lives of these two people had just started to connect. Jairus and his wife welcomed their baby girl into the world. That same year, the lives of these two people connected. Though they did not know each other at the time, God knew that they would one day meet each other on a day when they both needed Jesus the most. 12 years ago, both of them got their condition. Jairus received a daughter who would become sick, and the woman had her issue. And here they were, right on schedule. According to everyone but Jairus, of course, they're right on schedule. He's amazed at this healing, but at the same time, don't you think anxiety is starting to overtake him? It seems like everybody has forgotten about his child who is sitting back at his house who is dying. This already slow-moving entourage has ground to a standstill, and as a father, he's thinking they need to get moving. Time is of the essence here, and it was all actually just a test of faith of this man, because as we know, nothing surprises Jesus. Look at verses 35 through 37. While he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official, saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid any longer. Only believe." And he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. So the news came to Jairus while Jesus was still speaking to the woman. His worst nightmare had come true. They were too late. Even if they hadn't stopped for this woman, they probably wouldn't have made it in time anyway. Does this sound familiar to you? Like any of this has happened before? When word came to Jesus that his friend Lazarus was sick, he didn't immediately rush over there, and Lazarus ended up dying. Now Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, they both had the same response when Jesus finally did arrive. "Lord, if you had only been here, our brother would not have died. Lord, if you had been here, Lazarus would not have died." He knew. It was no surprise at all. The delay was part of his plan. Let's take a look at this account in John 11, verses 11 through 15. This he said, and after that he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of sleep." The disciples then said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus then said to them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Now we know from hindsight that Jesus is able to raise the dead, but at this time, this event had not yet happened. Jairus had no idea of what's about to happen, but he had faith that Jesus could have healed his daughter if they had been there on time. But how strong is his faith now? It's during times like this when God doesn't make sense to us that he's actually doing something big. So Jairus comes along. He sits in stunned silence, but he's still believing nonetheless. He doesn't lash out. He doesn't show any lack of faith. He still follows Christ. And also notice this is the first time that Jesus isolates these 3 disciples. He pulls those 3 out of the 12, Peter, James, and John. Jesus taught thousands. He was followed by hundreds. He was close to 12, but he was really only intimate with these 3. These 3 would pass along to the others what they had missed. So let's go ahead and continue this account, and we'll cover verses 38 through 40. And they came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion, and people loudly weeping and wailing. And entered in, he said to them, "Why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep." They began laughing at him, but putting them all out, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was. The funeral customs of that day and that place were really different from ours. During those funerals, there were 3 common things. Number 1, you would tear your clothes as a sign of mourning. So obviously, you wouldn't be dressed up in your nicest clothes. You would wear a garment that could be easily torn, and you would wear that torn garment for at least 30 days in some cases to show the extent of your mourning. Now, the second thing is there would be flutes playing sad music. This was a social requirement, even if you didn't like the flute. I'm a drum guy myself, but hey, flutes were what you were supposed to have, so flutes were playing there. And the third thing of a funeral in that day was there was loud wailing. Every service was required to have it, even if nobody knew that person. This led to the creation of a job called professional mourners. These were people who were hired to weep and to cry and to wail loudly in honor of the deceased. So I guess if you have nobody to cry at your funeral, you would have to hire somebody to do so. Now, the requirements for even the poorest Israelite was a minimum of at least 2 flutes and 1 wailing woman. So this is the commotion that we read about there in verse 38. The family of Jairus likely had already secured the services of professional mourners and wailers. And they walk in, there's these flutes being played. I can just picture them all out of key and off pitch and just a terrible racket. And these people wailing and screaming, and Jairus probably doesn't even know them. And what can that possibly do to comfort him? None. And you can tell that these people are not really family and friends, but they are hired workers, because when Jesus said in verse 39, "She is not dead but asleep," they laughed at him. At a funeral, they laughed. Who would laugh at something during such a time of sadness? People who had no emotional connection to the deceased, hired mourners. But with that statement, "She is not dead but asleep," Jesus redefined death as a temporary condition. That's why he compared it to sleep. We must always view everything in life from an eternal perspective. This life is not all that there is. Death is not the end. Life goes on in the spirit, and then there will be a physical resurrection as well. But it's so easy to forget that sometimes. We live on this earth, we live in this society, and we tend to forget that this isn't all there is. We are not citizens of this earth, but we are citizens of heaven. When somebody who is a believer dies, they are not gone. They do not cease to exist. They have simply gone home before us. They have made the journey that we all must make ourselves, and they are with Jesus. They will rise again. You will see them again. And this is why Jesus used the metaphor of comparing death to sleep. It's temporary. Now, some people teach that death is kind of a soul sleep, where you just drift off in unconsciousness. But that cannot be, because the Bible says to be absent from the the body is to be present with the Lord. You will be awake and you will be more aware of things than you have ever been before. And we need to remember that this world is not our home. As I said, we are citizens of heaven. We are created to dwell eternally in the new heaven and the new earth. Not this one. We are essentially doing what the Israelites had to do in the wilderness. We're going around and around in circles until our time comes to enter the promised land. So let us close with the display of Jesus' power over something as feared of as death. Let's look at verses 41 through 43. Taking the child by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded. And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this, and he said that something should be given her to eat. You know, I love it when the Bible gives the original language that was spoken in the text during the translation into our own language. They leave it in there. It's that way for a reason. It shows a close personal meaning of the wording. So here Jesus is. He's speaking to her. He's speaking to this girl. Not to a corpse, as everyone inside the house is thinking. He is talking to her, a person, an individual. He speaks to her in the language that she knows and that she understands. Now, if the girl had been Hispanic, he would have read, Nina despierta. If she had been German, it would say, Kleines Madkin walk off. Now, I know my language is terrible there, but forgive me on that. He spoke to her on her level. She spoke Aramaic, so he said to her, Talitha cum. Don't be afraid of not understanding anyone when you get to heaven. Don't be afraid about a language barrier. God has got this. So what that means in Aramaic at Talitha cum, it can mean little girl arise. But there's another common translation of that. It has the second meaning, little lamb arise, or wake up, my little lamb. Can you not just feel the warmth and compassion of Jesus in that phrase? She is not a corpse. She is one of his sheep, his little lamb, and it's time for her to arise out of that temporary condition that he simply called sleep. There is nothing that our Lord cannot do. Nothing is beyond Jesus' ability. Nothing is beyond his power. Nothing is out of his control. And even the littlest of things does not escape his attention of concern. He gave them strict orders that no one should know about this, and he said something should be given to her to eat. Don't do something to attract attention to this family by telling everybody. Let them have some time. They don't need the crowds in their house. They don't need to face the harsh questioning of the Pharisees. What happened here? By what power? He did this by the power of demons. No, they just need some peace, some time to enjoy their restored family, to celebrate their little girl being given back to them. And then Jesus said, get her something to eat. In all of this excitement, something like that would be forgotten. It's likely been days since she's been able to eat a meal. She is hungry, and they were still trying to wrap their minds around what had just happened, and this girl is over here starving. So there's so much here in these verses that we could use today. Number one, Jesus is able to do anything. Nothing is impossible for him. And then also we can see that Jesus is available. I can't even begin to imagine the burdens that the population of the entire world must place upon him. But he is divine, and he handles it with apparent ease. Another thing we've seen from the text here is social status does not matter to Jesus. Your rank does not make you more important than others, and your lowliness does not make you less important than others. He lifts up the low, and he brings down the lofty. We see in the text that Jesus cares. No matter how big or how small your problem is, whether you're dying or whether you are hungry, it doesn't escape his attention. He cares. But the most important of all of these things, out of all of this, the most important thing that we can take with us, if you take nothing else away from this study, remember this: Jesus has conquered the grave. He has paid for my sin. He has paid for your sin. And He defeated death by rising from the grave after 3 days. And it's because of that that we have the blessed hope of joining Him in the final resurrection, when there will be nothing that we will ever need to be delivered from. There will be nothing that we ever need to be healed of. And when that day comes, we will all be following Jesus with true hearts of devotion. No ulterior motives as some of those in the crowd had. Just pure worship of our Lord and Savior. Oh, what a day that will be.